Over the course of centuries, Dutch colonizers brought all of Indonesia under one government, known as the Dutch East Indies. But when the Netherlands was occupied by Germany, an Indonesian statesman took his chance. In 1945, he declared independence of the Republic of Indonesia. It would take another 10 years for Indonesia's tumultuous road to independence to end in victory. This is the Indonesian National Revolution with Hindsight. In 1927, Sukarno established the Indonesian National Party with friends from college. They advocated independence and were against imperialism and capitalism.
The German army storms past the border patrols.
2 years after the Netherlands was invaded by Germany, the Dutch East Indies came under attack by the Japanese. It took them less than 3 months to overrun the entire colony. At first, they were welcomed as liberators, but that sentiment wouldn't last. Japan recruited forced laborers, and under their watch, hunger was widespread. This killed over 4 million people under Japanese watch. But the Japanese also trained, armed, and educated Indonesian nationalists, and this set the stage for Indonesia's struggle for independence. On August 17, 1945, Ahmed Sukarno and Mohammed Hatta proclaimed independence from the Netherlands, and they established the Republic of Indonesia. The Japanese surrendered a month later, and the island nation was up for grabs. The Allied forces deployed 1,000 British soldiers to maintain order on the island of Java. A month later, the Dutch sent in troops and announced that they would not negotiate with the independence leaders, but instead they offered them autonomy within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This was unacceptable to Sukarno and Hatta, and a day later they declared war. This kicked off the first conflict phase in Indonesia's road to independence. The Dutch, British, and Indonesian troops clashed on Java and Sumatra. On October 13, 1945, the war started. 1 year and 1 day later, all parties agreed to a ceasefire. 10,000 people were killed during this conflict, and over 200,000 were displaced. In the first peace talks, the British agreed to withdraw its troops, and this was completed a few months later. The Dutch, however, did not bend. The conflict heated up again in the first months of 1947, when Dutch government troops broke the ceasefire in Sumatra, and fighting intensified. This lasted from December to March, and during this period 5,000 people were killed. The independence leaders and factions opposing the Dutch had to reorganize. The result? The United States of Indonesia. This new formation consisted of the Republic of Indonesia and the island of Borneo. But the meaning of this unification was disputed. The Netherlands, still recovering from World War II, was weakened and partly therefore showed a willingness to negotiate. The Dutch and the Indonesians negotiated for nearly 14 months, and their peace talks culminated towards the end of 1946. Leaders from the Netherlands and the Republic of Indonesia then finally reached a landmark agreement. Both parties agreed to recognize the Republic of Indonesia, the states of Borneo, and the state of East Indonesia. The status of New Guinea was still undecided, and the status of several islands was controversial. But the Netherlands outwardly acknowledged Indonesia's de facto authority in Java, Madura, and Sumatra, and this was lauded internationally as significant progress. The reality, however, was more complicated. The Dutch and the Indonesians had deep and fundamental differences on how this agreement should be interpreted. With hindsight, we know that only very few expected this to last. After reaching the agreement, the Dutch offered 5 proposals on how it could be implemented, but all were deemed unacceptable by Indonesia. The US offered financial support to Indonesia if they would agree to these terms, and it seemed to work, as it persuaded some leaders to accept a few of these conditions, but not all. Then the Netherlands demanded a ceasefire, which Indonesia rejected, and this was reason for the Dutch to end all negotiations. Fighting resumed and intensified. A few weeks after the conflict had reignited, governments of Australia and India brought the matter to the United Nations. They sent observers to monitor the conflict on the ground. The UK and later the United States offered to facilitate negotiations, but the Netherlands showed little to no willingness to talk. In July 1947, the Dutch had resumed its military activities, and 5 months later, they signed a peace accord with the Indonesian representatives. They met aboard the USS Renville, which was anchored in Jakarta Bay. All parties agreed to recognize a ceasefire along the so-called Van Mook Line. Much of what we now recognize as sovereign territory of Indonesia was then still under Dutch control. But the Dutch desperately wanted to re-establish their entire colony. Little under a year after all parties had promised a ceasefire, the Dutch made a series of military advances. They aggressively fought to gain control over major cities on Sumatra and Java, and by the end of 1949, they had gained the upper hand on both islands. But this series of military successes by the Netherlands was condemned by the international community. The League of Arab Nations voiced support for Indonesia and demanded that the Netherlands would retreat. The UN Security Council continued to order ceasefires, which the Dutch ignored every single time. Then the United States, who had been a powerful ally of the Dutch and who sought to defend its trade relations through Dutch authority in the region, made a critical decision to withdraw its support. This made the Dutch fragile and willing to negotiate. The United Nations formed a new council in January 1949. They mediated negotiations in The Hague, and later that same year, on December 27, 1949, Indonesia finally gained its independence. Watch one of these 2 videos next. There are many more momentous events that shaped the world. The video on the right is my personal suggestion, and the one on the left is suggested to you by the YouTube algorithm. So click on the one that piques your interest, and I'll see you there.